Serge Attukwei Clottey is an artist from Ghana whose practice develops alongside a generation of his peers from across the African continent who are really sort of grappling with inherited histories and who are also rethinking the way that aesthetic production from the region sort of is understood, displayed, and engaged discursively once it's trafficked into the intellectual and cultural sort of orders of the West. I think after the late 1990s, early 2000s, when you see a conceptual turn when it comes to Africa, largely defined by a show that happened at the Queen's Museum called Global Conceptualisms, you had very defined parameters with which to engage art or contemporary art more specifically from the African continent. But the context in which these younger artists are working is radically different than that context that we understood then, largely because at the time we were thinking about Africa in relationship to an expanding world, to rising globalisms. But now these artists are working in a political context that's backdropped against growing nationalisms, isolationism of Western powers, and shifting global dimensions. You have major new players in the continent who are engaging those countries differently. And I think it's very important to take that into consideration when looking at practices like Serge's and of his generations, which I think he is sort of an anchoring figure, because you begin to understand the way that these artists are responding to their material choices, their approaches for art making, and really challenging and pushing back against largely accepted categories through which we've sort of come to classify their work. For us, this exhibition, it's the first exhibition we do with an artist from Africa. It was very important for us to sort of find the right artist because we wanted to make sure that we set a tone for a particular kind of set of upcoming projects. And Serge really helps us sort of set the tone for our engagement with, artists and other cultural makers from the continent. We wanted an artist whose practice wasn't easily defined, who broke off in many ways from histories of his predecessors, and who really sort of set the tone for a new kind of engagement with current art making across Africa, and in particular Ghana. And I think one of the most interesting things that you see in Serge's practice, and I really do think it's a generational defining practice in many ways, is that you see a pretty aggressive questioning of certain taxonomies and categories that have largely sort of set up the way that we talk about artists from the African continent. In the early 90s, you still had debates about whether we consider something an art object or an artifact, or if something like a daily ritual or a ceremony could be talked about in terms of a performance of everyday life and not sort of through an anthropological lens. And what is very sort of intriguing about Serge's practice is that he walks that boundary and intercrosses it very much with everything he does, from having carved wooden objects and working with materials like, bronze and plastic, and doing these kind of handmade objects that aren't necessarily craft. There's a conceptual impetus behind them. But I think pushing that divide between a kind of Western art making practice and a non-Western one is at the core of what Serge is trying to do with the work that he does. Serge's main material of working is a yellow plastic gallon that in Ghana is sort of commonly known as the Kufor gallon. It was introduced by Westerners and used largely to transport cooking oil. But during one of Ghana's most severe droughts, which actually happened when Serge was a child, women started using the gallons to transport water. And they'd have to travel, particularly outside of urban centers. So in smaller villages and towns, they'd have to travel long distances to get access to potable water. And these gallons were sort of used for that. So you'd see processions of women and men and children with these gallons kind of moving water, from urban centers to their homes. And I think it's a very seemingly banal object, but when you look at it more symbolically, it's very loaded. Its use, its function as a transport mechanism speaks to histories of migration and trade in particular. But also, more symbolically, the yellow band of the Ghanaian flag stands in for the country's rich sort of mineral history and its richness of resources. But here it sort of stands in or represents a lack of a vital resource, which is water. So it's both becomes a symbol of pride and a symbol of plight. And the use of this material to make these large scale tapestry like works, I think, speaks largely to that history of trade and migration and resources. And I think more broadly, it also speaks to a colonial project that many people still think was sort of isolated to the Europeans carving out Africa. But now, when you look at what's happening now, the colonial project is still very much present. It's just different actors at play. And in particular, you have China moving into the African continent to get 100-year-long leases on mining for rare earth materials, to control water resources. So it's also still happening. And while the sort of centers of power have shifted, these similar colonial dynamics are still at play. And I think that this material that Serge uses really brings that into focus. The work has a function, and I think that's what I find most interesting, is that he works with local community members to cut these things up, sew them together. It's a very labor-intensive process. And then the work is like used to, in many ways, kind of give color to some of these smaller towns, and in particular to Labadi, where Serge is working, where you have large tapestry works on sides of some of the homes, or in these large scale floor pieces that cover like entire sections of small villages. And that I find sort of fascinating as a conversation about what constitutes an art object versus what constitutes a functional artifact. And there's a long history in the West of thinking that any art object, particularly after the conceptual turn, can be functional, right? If it's functional, it's not art, it's an artifact, it's an object of use. You still see that in museums. If you ever walk in through an ethnographic museum, you go through the arts of Africa or arts of Oceania, you'll see that the lights are dimmer, that the objects are difficult to see, that they're talked about as tools, or they're talked about as these kind of items that are meant to be used, as opposed to when you walk into, let's say, the area where you have Greek antiquities and it's bright because they want you to kind of pay attention to the master artistry. And that's not the case when it comes to histories of the non-Western world. So when I think about Serge's practice and how it's sort of talked about and engaged, I think about those same conversations. Because yes, these works have a function. He treats them not so preciously, and they're meant to be used on the floor and to be walked on. And this comes from a very specific context. And so many people don't necessarily think that there's a conceptual project behind them. But I think the choice of material itself, the color, there are symbolic orders at play that move the work to be able to have functions that are conceptual and that can exist in a gallery, but at the same time can very much be installed in a small village in Africa as well. I think the most recognizable body of work that Serge produces are these large-scale plastic wall works with the gallons, but there's also a very constant and robust drawing practice. And for me, the drawing practice is what I sort of think about as sort of the constant in many ways in Serge's work, right? I think the large-scale wall works have more of a public interface at times, but I think the drawings are really anchored in one type of reclaiming that I think is central to the entire practice. And it's the reclaiming of stolen and trafficked images that largely were inspired by the African continent, by its aesthetic production, by masks and sort of other traditional objects. And you had Europeans that came and visited, most famously people like Picasso, who then used these images, trafficked them intellectually in many ways, to launch the modernist movement in Europe, to kind of create work that we now think about as Cubism. And so when you see a lot of Serge's drawings, there's a reclaiming of the kind of things that came out of inspirational sources from Africa. So it's this very kind of different kind of reclaiming. He's not necessarily sort of, taking back objects or repatriating objects, but it's almost as if he's attempting to reclaim these ideas, this intellectual property that belonged to Africans and that was taken and that fueled artistic movements in the West. So when you look at the images of the multiple figures with faces that look as if they have masks on, I think when people see them, I think the cheap answer is to say, oh, well, it's just, a reference to the European Cubists. But when you actually really think about them as being reclaimed images of sources of inspiration, of source material that was very much stolen by these European masters and then reworked and then given another kind of title, it's a really interesting sort of approach, a kind of conceptual reclaiming and repatriation of imagery, of an imaginary that was stolen from Africa. And I think in particular it's very interesting now, considering that there is a growing discourse and political push for repatriation. The French president has been a very big advocate since he took office about repatriating objects back to African museums. The conversation around the kind of pillaging by Western museums has been happening. So I think it's an interesting parallel to look at when thinking about the work that Serge is making as a different kind of repatriation, a repatriation of ideas. When Serge's mother passed, a lot of her belongings would have normally gone to the oldest daughter. Serge used his mother's belongings as a way to grapple with memory. And I think it really instigates an approach for Serge about how he deals with performance. He has often said that he thinks about performance as an everyday act. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about the notion of the performative. I think in the West, we think about performance in many ways like an aesthetic object, right? It's supposed to be something that's consumable when you see it, and you think of histories of performance art. But that gets more complicated when you look at it in non-Western contexts, when there's daily rituals that are often only understood to local communities. The things that we do when somebody passes, the way that we engage our elders, our weddings, like all of these traditions are performative in many ways. And in a non-Western context, performances are bodily forms of inscription. There are other ways to tell and index history. So when you look at the work that Serge is doing, in many ways, it's also about grappling with the way that we remember, the way that we inherit pasts that we didn't necessarily experience ourselves. He staged a powerful performance where he wore his mother's clothes after she passed, and then kind of staged the procession with other people as a way of sort of grappling with this, with a very intense sort of family loss. And I think when considered just from a Western perspective, it's very easy to just kind of push that as just a performance. But I think when looked at from more local context, you see that it's also an attempt to sort of reinscribe a biography, a familial history. His performances that he does with the masks, you turning these gallons into wearable objects, engaging communities in processions and parades. Processions are also sort of spatial forms of inscription. They tell you about a place, they tell you how to navigate through a community. So performance for Serge isn't necessarily just looked at as a consumable object. It's not meant to be just for a staging. It's actually in many ways meant to highlight the way that many things that happen in our local everyday lives are performative by nature. And in doing so, it's speaking more about what these performances actually do in the world and how they help us cope with things from droughts to family losses to trauma and grief. So the exhibition Solo Chorus really, for me, has two functions, or I wanted it to have two functions. The first was to look at Serge's interest in materiality by including the works made out of the gallons, some of the wall sculptures, as a way to sort of show how he's sort of pushing the boundaries of these categories that have defined sort of African contemporary art for a very long time, right? So thinking about how something can be a conceptual art object, but at the same time have a function in another context. And so that forms one part of the exhibition. And you see that with the inclusion of a kind of large scale architectonic installation of multiple of these works, of a kind of newly produced piece that has a wall function in the space, some of the wooden work, including as well some of the sort of wall pieces that are used in some of his installations and created from wood and other found objects. So that is sort of one part of the installation. We wanted to be able to include context, and so we included photographic documentation of some of these installations, which is not necessarily so conventional for, I think, a contemporary art exhibition at least, but it was important to be able to have viewers see how these things exist in other places once they're sort of taken out of context and put in a gallery. The other kind of part for me was this, to kind of highlight his interest in reclaiming these kind of ideas and these influences that emerge from Africa, but yet have fueled artistic movements in the West. So there's a section in the exhibition that includes a suite of his large-scale works on paper. You have figures that whose heads have been replaced with cubist-like structures, or they've been replaced with masks that he makes, so the mask re-enters as a motif in the drawings, and to be able to kind of show this reclaiming of ideas that's very much a daily exercise in terms of the production of these drawings, as well as the bronzes, and transforming them from this, into this valuable material through an intensive process. We wanted to be able to include a performance, but I think the exhibition also in many ways from a logistical standpoint speaks to the kind of environment in which Serge and his peers are working in. And it's a world largely defined by growing isolationism. Serge was denied a visa to the United States, so we were not able to stage a series of opening performances as we had hoped. And while much of what we know today as contemporary African art early on, when we think about like kind of major figures, they all came of age at a time when the world was pushing to be more interconnected and global, right? When you had the beginning of trade agreements, and you had like globalization really take on as an organizing system for the world. And we would hear conversations about borders disappearing, and now they're very much being reformed. And these nation states that had been dissolved are very much regaining form. And it's making it harder for people to move across these boundaries. And what's dangerous about that, especially when we think about the work that Serge and others like him are making in Africa, is that we shift our mode of engagement from one that is attempting to understand others who aren't like us, to one that's attempting to not engage and necessarily let these practices evolve on their own right. And it's when we refuse, I think, to accept and be disagreeable with others who aren't necessarily like us, that we always end in body counts. And so I think that that's one of the most important functions in many ways of practices like Serge's and institutions, I hope, with the Mistake-Room that we can do, is in a humble way be able to kind of push back in that way by being staunchly worldly and demanding that practices like this get a platform to be seen in the West.